Hi, my name is John Whetten, and I am the Director of Special Projects at Young Living, which means that I had the privilege to travel the world with Gary. It is a real honor and immense responsibility to share with Young Living members what I learned during the many years that I worked for Gary and traveled the world with him. This is the first photo that I took of Gary, and it is probably obvious that we are in Oman. And you have likely heard of Oman because it is the location of the ancient frankincense trail and where Boswellia sacra grows, the sacred frankincense. To this day, I'm still a little amazed that I ended up going on this trip with Gary. Today, I want to share with all of you the story of how I ended up being behind the camera in Oman to take this photograph. Before I went with Gary to Oman, I had already been working for Young Living for about a year, and I was part of the product development team at the time, working as a research assistant. And even though I knew who Gary was, I don't think he knew who I was. Then one day, Gary came into the lab and began telling us about the project that he was working on at the time, which was a documentary about frankincense and the legendary frankincense trail. Gary had just returned from Oman and was telling us all about the amazing things that he had learned and that he was planning on going back a few months later to continue recording video for the documentary. I was really intrigued by the project, and all I could think about was how much I wanted to go to Oman and be a part of this project so I could learn firsthand about the things that Gary was telling us. Then Gary told us he was looking for a new camera operator, and I thought, maybe this is my chance to join the project. And so I told Gary that I had experience shooting and editing video, and I hoped to be considered for the job. After Gary finished meeting with us about the products that we would be launching later that year at convention, he left the lab, and then he returned a few minutes later with a professional high-definition video camera and handed it to me and said, "Go shoot and edit something this weekend and show it to me on Monday, and if I like it, then you can go with me to Oman." So basically, Gary was giving me a job interview, and I was excited, but also a little terrified, because even though I had just told Gary that I knew a thing or two about cameras, I was actually a still photographer, and I had never before touched a professional video camera. But that night, after I got home from work, I began desperately reading through the user manual to figure out what all the buttons did and the features of this video camera. But the real challenge that lay ahead of me was that I had 2 days to shoot and edit a mini documentary. So the next morning, on Saturday, my little brother and sister were competing in an archery tournament, so I decided to make their small archery tournament the subject of my mini documentary. So I shot video of the kids shooting arrows at the targets, and then I interviewed their coach and a few parents, all of the normal stuff that you would expect to see. But when I got home that evening and I plugged the camera into my computer, I found out that the non-professional editing software that I owned was not capable of reading the files from this very professional video camera, and that I needed professional software. I would also like to remind everyone that this is before online app stores, so it was not possible to just download some software. At that time, software came on a CD, and you had to get in your car and drive to the store and buy it, and it came with an installation code, which is very different from how things work now. Anyway, it was late Saturday night, and all of the stores were closed and would not be open until Monday, and besides, the software that I needed was $1,000, which was far outside of my budget for the gamble that I was running. So in desperation, I called my brother, who is a few years younger than me and attending university. He and I look so similar that people who don't know us well would often get us mixed up, and so I asked him if I could use his university ID and his username and password so that I could sneak into the computer lab at the university library to convert the video files from this camera to files that I could edit on my computer at home. A few minutes before the computer lab closed on Saturday night, I walked out carrying a hard drive with the converted video files that I could edit at home. So the next day on Sunday, I spent a good part of the day editing this video, adding titles and music and making it look nice, and then on Monday morning, when I showed Gary, he turned to me and he said, "You're hired." So my weekend of hustle and desperation and ingenuity and hard work had paid off. But I never told Gary that I had spent the weekend desperately reading through the user manual and how I snuck into my brother's university to use the computer lab. Over the next few months before we left on this trip, I took the camera home every weekend and practiced shooting with it because I was determined to learn everything about that camera that I could so that I would not let Gary down. So, on my first trip to the Middle East with Gary, we went to Oman, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel. Gary was making a stop in France on the way home to check on the lavender farm there. So in Israel, Gary and the rest of us parted ways. But as we were driving to the airport, Gary called Kelly, his executive assistant, and asked her to book me a flight to Ecuador the following week because Gary needed a cameraman to go with him on his next adventure. And that's how I found out I was going to Ecuador. At that time, in 2009, Gary and Mary were living in Ecuador and running the farm and health spa there. Every year they held an event called Amazon Adventure. The event was open to any member who wanted to attend. All that was required was purchasing a ticket. So it was a real unique opportunity to spend time with Gary in Ecuador. The itinerary for Amazon Adventure included raindrop training, a day at the school and the farm, and then a few days up in the Andes Mountains to go whitewater rafting and rappelling down waterfalls. The day before we flew to Ecuador, Gary called me and told me to buy a waterproof shell for the video camera because he wanted to get really good footage of the whitewater rafting. We flew out on Sunday morning, so this was another Saturday night, and of course, the stores were all closed. So I went online, and the waterproof housing that you could buy for this particular camera was manufactured in Europe and was about $5,000 and would take a week to ship to South America. So I knew that purchasing a waterproof housing was not an option. So I continued to do some research on the internet about how to build a DIY waterproof camera housing. Because even though I hadn't spent much time with Gary, I had already learned that saying things like, "That's not possible," would not end well. So after a trip to the hardware store to pick up a cutting board, some plexiglass, and clear vinyl, all of which cost less than $50, and then a few hours spent in my parents' garage using hand tools, I had assembled a waterproof camera housing that worked, and you can see it in this photo. My favorite thing about this photo is that Gary took it. Gary was a great photographer. Over the next 9 years, variations of this story were repeated over and over again. Gary would need something, or I would need to learn how to do something for the next adventure that we were going on. And I would stay up late or work over the weekend, but it was totally worth it. After the Amazon Adventure event was over and all of the Young Living members returned back to their countries, I stayed in Ecuador for a few more weeks and followed Gary everywhere he went. And I got to witness firsthand Gary's work ethic. He was the CEO of Young Living and also managing a farm, so that meant doing everything from helping to order supplies, to running the distillery, to fixing farm equipment when it broke down. And I took hundreds of photos of Gary during this time, and some of them are still in use today. So speaking of stuff breaking, I was secretly happy when the sickle bar mower broke, because then these guys showed up with machetes, and I got some really cool photos of lemongrass being harvested by hand. It was really enlightening to see that Gary was not the stereotypical CEO that spent time behind a desk and in meetings. He spent his days in the fields alongside everyone else. While I was still in Ecuador, Gary took me on a 3-day rafting trip down the Rio Bobanaza, which is a tributary to the Amazon River, to look for new aromatic plants. This trip is famous because Gary often said that this was one of his closest brushes with death, and Mary really likes to tell the story too. The interesting thing is that in both Gary's version and my version of this story, we almost died. However, the difference in our versions of the story is how we almost died. So today I get to tell my version. At the place where we entered the Rio Bobanaza, it was a very small river, which was not very deep, as you can see from these donkeys crossing the river. In some places, the river widened out, and so the water became so shallow that we had to get out and pull our inflatable raft over the rocks. Even though I don't have video of us pulling the raft over the rocks, you can see people doing a similar thing with their canoe. The river is the highway through the Amazon jungle in this area, so we saw a lot of other boats, especially these small dugout wooden canoes. On the first day, we were having a great time. and there didn't seem to be anything to worry about. However, on the afternoon of the second day, it began to rain, and it rained all night long, and it rained really, really hard, and did not stop until the next morning. And the water was coming right through the tent, and I felt like I was in the shower while we were inside of the tent trying to sleep. And when we woke up the next morning, this is what things looked like. We bought this tent in the States and took it with us, so it was brand new, but it was no match for the rainstorm that we had that night. With all the rain, the river rose about 10 feet or 3 meters, and the little stream that we could have stood up in on the first and second day was now flowing very, very fast and deep and filled with debris and whirlpools, and we did not have life jackets with us. Giovanni, our guide, was obviously very concerned about the conditions of the river and told us to be very careful, and if we capsized, to hold on to the raft for dear life and to not worry about saving anything but ourselves. I only have one short video clip of us on the river that day because the conditions were so scary that I only picked up the camera this one time. And this was a fairly calm area, so you can see that the river is now very wide and moving very swiftly. Hindsight is always 20/20. This video clip is from the day before, and you can see how there is a lot of debris along the banks of the river, and it is stripped of vegetation, which should have been a warning to us that the river has the potential to rise when there's a lot of rain. So this is a really good visual of how much more water was in the river on that day. We very nearly capsized several times when we got sucked into whirlpools, but we eventually made it to the takeout point, and we were exhausted, and I was glad to be alive and off the river. Had we capsized, I may not be here today, and I can also tell you that Gary was not a great swimmer, so I think we were lucky. After working for Gary for about a year, the lead mechanic at the Mona Farm, who was also in charge of insuring all of the vehicles for Young Living's U.S. operations, called me up and said, "John, I think it's important for you to know that you are fully insured on every vehicle that Young Living owns, because I know that at any time Gary might ask you to drive any of the trucks or tractors. So I just want you to know that if you are driving and there is an accident or mishap or something breaks, don't worry about it because you are fully covered." And then he said, "And by the way, there are only 3 people who are fully insured on every vehicle. You, me, and Gary." And then he finished off by saying, "Last year, we only had 3 insurance claims for damage, and every one of those claims happened when Gary was driving." Gary was not afraid of breaking things. He was not afraid of taking risks. And I also believe this is one of the reasons why he was so successful. And I have a personal story that I want to share that helps to illustrate the importance of not being afraid of breaking things. When I was born, my dad was a high school teacher, and he taught horticulture and farm management. And around 1980, he convinced the high school to purchase a single computer so that his farm management students could learn how to do business planning using spreadsheet software. And of course, computers were quite rare and expensive back in the early 1980s. Soon after that, my dad purchased a personal computer and began to teach himself how to code and write software. And then a couple of years later, he was no longer the horticulture teacher at the high school because he was teaching computer science. The point of telling you all of this is that I was surrounded by computers when I was growing up, and I don't remember a time when we didn't have a computer in our home. So a few years ago, my mom was trying to start a small business, and she needed some help doing some graphic design work. So she called me up and asked me if I would come over and help her. And while I was trying to show her how to do some very basic stuff in Photoshop, I quickly realized that she lacked even the most basic computer skills. And I sat there kind of in shock. After all, there must have been 20 computers in my parents' house over the years, and there was ample opportunity to learn how to use them. And so I wondered how it was possible that my mom, who had spent nearly her entire adult life surrounded by computers, lacked these basic skills. When I asked her about it, she told me that she felt that all of the computers belonged to my dad, and she was afraid of breaking them, and so she never really used them or learned how to use them. My mom's birthday was a few weeks later, so I'm sure you can guess what she received as a gift. Yes, her very own computer. And because that computer is hers, she doesn't have to be worried about breaking it and affecting anyone else. And so she learned how to use it very quickly. When new executives were hired on at Young Living, Gary would often organize activities with an element of risk, such as skiing, horseback riding, hunting, river rafting, or snowmobiling. And I think that these activities were kind of Gary's version of a job interview, with the goal of assessing the new executive's ability to manage risk and see how they would react when faced with new challenges, because Gary knew that there is inherent risk in running a business, and he wanted to make sure that the people helping him run Young Living would take enough risks to help drive Young Living forward and continue to grow. Gary often told me that he would much rather see people take risks and fail than to never try at all. One of my favorite quotes is this: "Fear kills more dreams than failure ever will." So, if you want to be more like Gary, you're going to have to get good at breaking things. Gary was always breaking things: phones and computers and cameras, his back, trucks. This is a dump truck that Gary was driving during the construction of the Northern Lights distillery in British Columbia, Canada. The soil in the dump bed froze, and when he tried to dump it out, the truck tipped over. In one of Gary's classic lectures that I got to listen to many, many times, he talked about a survey of 50 people over 95 years old in which they were asked what they would do differently if they could live their lives over again. And one of the top 3 answers was, take more risks. A lot of people have told me how lucky I was to work so closely with Gary, but I was usually pretty quick to correct them and say that working with Gary was not lucky, it was risky, and it was a lot of hard work. And just like the story about becoming Gary's cameraman, there were many times I told Gary I knew how to do something and then went home and spent all night learning how to do it so that I wouldn't be lying. Gary's attitude towards life was quite similar, and I think that's one of the reasons why we got along so well. I tell people that my secret to success while working with Gary was to take as much risk as possible without crossing over the line to being reckless, and I think this is a good motto to live by. Gary didn't need anyone's approval to try something new, and in January of 2017, Gary entered a 200-mile or 320-kilometer dog sled race in Alaska. Most people would spend years training for such a difficult event, but not Gary. He showed up at the start line with 7 days of training. And this is the photo of Gary at the start of that race. And then this photo is of Gary about 50 miles or 80 kilometers into that race. After the race was over, Gary decided that he was now experienced, and so he decided to sign up for something bigger and more difficult. So 6 days later, he entered another race. This one was 300 miles or 480 kilometers, and it was a bit colder, as you can probably tell from this photo. Gary's attitude was that there is no better way to train for a race than to just compete in one. Whenever I think about Gary getting things done, he was successful because he didn't hesitate to just begin doing it. This is one of the last photos that I took of Gary, as he was coming across the finish line of that second race. Gary finished both of these races in second to last place. He wasn't worried about winning or being the best. He was there to learn and to gain experience and to use what he learned on the next thing. I think everyone is familiar with this photograph. It was taken at the Northern Lights farm. I'm not going to go through the entire story, but the construction of this distillery took place almost entirely during the brutally cold winter of 2014-2015. Young Living had been previously buying black spruce from a small supplier in Canada, and then the person running that operation suddenly retired, and Young Living quickly ran out of black spruce, and many products, including Valor, went out of stock. Gary was desperate to begin building the Northern Lights distillery to guarantee Young Living's supply of black spruce for the future. By the time he began pouring concrete, it was already autumn, and the temperature at night was dropping below freezing. Everyone tried to convince him to stop construction until spring because it was so expensive and difficult to work during the winter. But Gary refused to quit. I heard him say, "How can I quit when I get 100 emails a day asking when Valor is going to be back in stock?" This photo was taken on March 9th, 2015, roughly 6 months after construction began. And Gary is watching the first few drops of oil rise in the very first distillation of Northern Lights black spruce. He had worked all winter long in the brutal cold, motivated by his love for all of us. And you can tell by the expression on his face that he is tired, but also relieved that such a difficult project is coming to completion. Gary hated this photo because he said that it showed his wrinkles. But to all of us who knew Gary, these wrinkles represented the love that he had for all of us. And maybe if he hadn't worked so hard and slept a little more, those wrinkles wouldn't have been quite so deep. But Young Living also wouldn't be what it is today. Gary was constantly taking risks in pursuit of his dream, which was to give us the best and purest essential oils. I'm so glad that Gary took a risk on me and allowed me to be his cameraman, which then opened up so many other opportunities that I never imagined to be possible. I hope that Gary's example will inspire all of you to take more risks in pursuit of your dreams. And if, from time to time during the pursuit of your dreams, you happen to break something, I think that you would make Gary very proud, because then you would know that you are living on the edge.